What would you do if the only person who called you a burden was the very person who taught you to be grateful to them for life? Well, I sold everything they thought was theirs to reclaim my own freedom. My name is Lena Harper, and I'm 31 years old. I work as a real estate broker in one of the most competitive markets in the country. It's ironic, really, considering what I'm about to tell you. The house that changed everything wasn't just another property listing, it was my inheritance, my sanctuary, and ultimately, the key to my liberation. The Victorian mansion on Hawthorne Street stood like a sentinel against time, its weathered brick facade hiding countless memories within its walls. Nearly $1 million in value. According to my professional assessment, though its worth to me had always been immeasurable. My grandmother Margaret left it to me when she passed away 3 years ago, and it was the only genuine comfort I'd known throughout my difficult childhood. Growing up in the Harper household meant understanding scarcity before abundance, criticism before praise. My parents, Gregory and Marla Harper, weren't cruel in the traditional sense. They didn't hit me or starve me. Instead, they mastered the art of emotional taxation, constantly reminding me of the price they paid for my existence. I remember our cramped rental apartment on the wrong side of town, where the walls were so thin you could hear every argument, every sigh of frustration, every muttered complaint about bills. My father worked construction when he could find it, and my mother picked up shifts at the diner downtown. Money was perpetually tight, and somehow, I was always the reason why. If we didn't have to buy you new shoes every year, we could actually save something, my mother would say, examining my feet like they were personally offensive to her. Do you know how much your school supplies cost? My father would add, waving receipts like evidence in a trial I never asked to be part of. But weekends were different. Weekends meant Grandma Margaret. She'd pull up in her old Buick every Friday afternoon, and I'd already be waiting by the window, my small overnight bag packed with the few nice things I owned. The drive to her house felt like traveling to another world entirely, where my parents' apartment smelled of disappointment and fried food. Grandma's house smelled of lavender and lemon polish. "How's my favorite girl?" she'd ask, and unlike when other adults said things like that, I knew she meant it. The Victorian mansion was magic to my young eyes. 3 stories of possibility, with a wraparound porch that creaked in all the right places and a garden that bloomed with colors I didn't even know existed. My grandmother would let me help her tend the roses, teaching me patience and care in ways my parents never had. "You see this one here," she'd say, pointing to a particularly stubborn bud. "Some people would give up on it, say it's taking too long to bloom, but we know better, don't we? The best things in life are worth waiting for, worth nurturing." I'd nod solemnly, understanding even then that she wasn't just talking about flowers. During those weekend visits, my grandmother would tell me stories about her own life, how she'd started with nothing, built a small business from scratch, invested wisely, and never let anyone tell her what she was worth. "Your value isn't determined by what others think you cost them. Lena," she'd say, her weathered hands gentle on my shoulders. "Don't let anyone convince you that you're a burden. You decide your own worth." Those words became my anchor, especially when Sunday evening came and I had to return to my parents' reality. The contrast was jarring, where Grandma's house had books and art and music. My parents' apartment had bills spread across the kitchen table and the constant hum of financial anxiety. They loved me, I suppose, in their own limited way. But their love came with an itemized invoice. "We sacrificed so much for you," became their refrain. Every school event that required a fee, every growth spurt that meant new clothes, every birthday that demanded even a modest celebration. All of it was tallied and presented as evidence of their martyrdom. I learned to make myself small. I stopped asking for things. I wore clothes until they fell apart, did homework by streetlight when they said we needed to save electricity, and pretended I wasn't hungry when money was especially tight. But it was never enough. The ledger of their resentment only grew longer. My teenage years were an exercise in invisibility. While my classmates talked about college plans and career dreams, I knew better than to voice any ambitions that might cost money. I worked part-time jobs from the moment I was legally able, saving every penny I could. But even that wasn't without criticism. Must be nice to have money to waste on yourself. My mother would comment when she saw me buy a used textbook with my own earnings. When I was your age, every cent went to helping my family. My father would add, conveniently forgetting that his parents had paid for his trade school. The only respite remained those weekends with Grandma Margaret. As I grew older, our conversations deepened. She saw through my careful cheerfulness, recognized the weight I carried. "You're planning your escape, aren't you?" she asked one afternoon when I was 17, both of us sitting on the porch swing. I couldn't deny it. "Is that wrong?" "Not at all, sweetheart. Sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. Even with family, especially with family." She helped me apply for scholarships, wrote recommendation letters, and even secretly paid for my SAT prep courses. When I got accepted to college with a partial scholarship, she was the only one who celebrated. "This is just the beginning," she promised. "You're going to build something beautiful with your life." My parents' reaction was predictably bitter. "So, you're just going to leave us after everything we've done for you?" my mother demanded. "All that money we spent raising you, and this is how you repay us," my father added. I wanted to scream that I hadn't asked to be born, that children aren't investments meant to yield returns. But I'd learned that defending myself only prolonged the arguments. So I nodded, agreed to send money home when I could, and counted the days until I could leave. College was a revelation. For the first time in my life, I was valued for my contributions rather than resented for my existence. I thrived in my business classes, particularly real estate. There was something about understanding property values, market trends, and investment potential that appealed to the girl who'd grown up being treated like a depreciating asset. Grandma Margaret remained my biggest cheerleader. She'd visit campus, take me to nice restaurants, and remind me that success was the best response to those who doubted me. We never directly discussed my parents during those visits, but her meaning was clear. "The house will be yours one day," she mentioned casually during my senior year. "I've already made the arrangements. It's what you deserve." I protested, but she waved me off. "I've seen how that house brings you peace. Besides, your parents will get what's fair. I'm not cutting them out entirely, just making sure the house goes where it's most loved." After graduation, I threw myself into building my career. Real estate in a major market was cutthroat. But I had advantages others didn't: an intimate understanding of what home meant to people, and the drive of someone who'd been told they were worthless, finally proving otherwise. I sent money to my parents monthly, even as my own student loans demanded attention. It was never acknowledged as enough, but I kept sending it anyway. Some part of me still hoping to finally pay off the debt they insisted I owed. Then Grandma Margaret died. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. She'd passed peacefully in her sleep, the roses in her garden in full bloom as if they'd waited to say goodbye. The grief hit me like a physical blow. I'd lost the only person who'd ever truly seen me as a gift, rather than a burden. The will reading was tense. My parents arrived dressed in black, but with eyes bright with anticipation. The lawyer, a stern woman named Miss Chen, read through the provisions with clinical detachment. "To my son Gregory and daughter-in-law Marla, I leave the sum of $50,000 to be divided equally between them." I saw my parents exchange glances, disappointment flickering across their faces. "To my granddaughter, Lena Harper, I leave my house at 42 Hawthorne Street and all its contents, to be hers entirely and without condition." The silence that followed was deafening. Then my mother's sharp intake of breath, my father's face turning red. "That's not right," my father said. "That house should be ours. We're her immediate family." Ms. Chen's expression didn't change. "The will is quite clear, Mr. Harper, and completely legal." They turned to me, and in their eyes, I saw not grief for Grandma Margaret, but rage at being denied what they felt entitled to. "You manipulated her," my mother accused. "Turned her against us." "She left you $50,000, I pointed out quietly. "That's not nothing." "Compared to $1 million house," my father spat. You always were greedy, even as a child. I wanted to laugh at the irony, or cry. Instead, I simply gathered the papers Ms. Chen handed me and left. The house felt different without Grandma Margaret in it. Heavier somehow, despite the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. I spent the first few weeks after her death just wandering the rooms, touching surfaces she'd touched, finding notes she'd left in book margins, catching lingering traces of her lavender perfume. My parents didn't waste time with mourning. Within a month, they showed up at the door with suitcases. "We've been evicted," my mother announced, pushing past me into the foyer. "The landlord sold the building. We have nowhere else to go." I stood there, mouth open, as they began bringing in box after box. "But you have $50,000. You could find another place." "Don't be ridiculous," my father said. "That money is for our retirement. We'll stay here temporarily while we figure things out." Temporarily, the word hung in the air like a false promise. Against every instinct, I let them stay. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was hope that living in Grandma's house might soften them somehow. Maybe it was just the old pattern of making myself smaller to accommodate their needs. They took over the master bedroom immediately. "We're older. We need the space," my mother justified, already redecorating with her own things. Within weeks, temporarily began to feel permanent. They rearranged furniture, disposed of items they deemed clutter, many of them precious to me, and began referring to it as our family home. "We should renovate the kitchen," my mother announced one morning, spreading out magazine clippings on the dining table. "Something more modern." "That's expensive," I ventured. "Well, you're doing well in real estate, aren't you? Consider it an investment in your inheritance." "This is my inheritance," I reminded her gently. The look she gave me could have curdled milk. "After everything we sacrificed for you, you can't even maintain a proper home for your aging parents." The old patterns reasserted themselves with disturbing ease. Despite owning the house outright, I found myself paying for everything: utilities, repairs, renovations they insisted were necessary. They treated me like a guest who should be grateful for the privilege of funding their lifestyle. "The property taxes are due," they'd mention casually, never offering to contribute. "The roof needs work," they'd observe, as if I hadn't noticed. "Since you're doing so well, perhaps you could help with our medical bills." Always framed as a suggestion, but delivered as an expectation. I complied, telling myself it was temporary, that once they got back on their feet, things would change. But their feet seemed permanently planted in my grandmother's house, my house, with no intention of moving. They began hosting family gatherings, introducing the place as our home to relatives who cooed over their good fortune. No one mentioned that I was the actual owner. I was just Lena, dutiful daughter, living at home to care for her parents. The renovations they wanted grew more elaborate. A new deck, updated bathrooms, professional landscaping that destroyed Grandma's beloved rose garden in favor of low-maintenance alternatives. "We're increasing the property value," my father would say whenever I protested. "You should be thanking us." I paid for it all, watching my savings dwindle while they spoke of future plans for their house. They even began hinting at their friends about potentially willing it to charity when they passed. Since Lena is so successful on her own, 3 years passed this way. 3 years of me sleeping in what had been my childhood room during weekend visits, while they occupied the master suite. 3 years of coming home to find more changes, more demands, more assumptions about what I owed them. "We're thinking of converting the third floor into a rental unit," my mother mentioned one evening, "for extra income." "Whose income?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Well, ours, naturally. We're the ones living here full-time. You're always at work anyway." That night, I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, and realized I'd recreated my childhood. Despite owning $1 million property, despite having a successful career, I was still the burden my parents reluctantly tolerated in exchange for resources. Then came the Europe trip. 6 weeks, my mother announced, showing me brochures. "We've always dreamed of seeing Paris, Rome, Barcelona." "That's wonderful," I said carefully. You must be excited to finally use some of your savings for something special. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Lena, my father said, using the tone he'd perfected when I was young, the one that made me feel simultaneously guilty and worthless. Do you have any idea what we gave up for you? The trips we couldn't take, the things we couldn't buy. And now, when we're finally at an age to enjoy life, you begrudge us a simple vacation. I'm not begrudging anything, I just thought— You thought wrong, my mother interrupted. After all, we're maintaining your property value by living here. The least you can do is show some gratitude. I wrote the check. $20,000 for a 6-week European adventure I couldn't afford to take myself. They left with barely a thank you, already discussing additional trips they planned to take, now that we know Lena understands her responsibilities. 2 weeks into their trip, a storm hit. Nothing severe, but enough to cause some damage to the roof. I discovered it when water began dripping into the kitchen, and I needed to file an insurance claim immediately. I called my father's phone, hoping to get some information about where he kept the homeowner's insurance documents. He answered on the third ring, voices and laughter audible in the background. What is it, Lena? We're at dinner. Dad, the roof is leaking. I need to file an insurance claim. Do you know where? Check the filing cabinet in the study, he said impatiently. Second drawer, manila folder marked House. Thanks, Is that all because we're with new friends and— Yes, that's all. Enjoy your dinner. I heard him set the phone down but not disconnect. The voices became clearer as he presumably put the phone in his pocket. Sorry about that, I heard him say. Lena needed something, as always. Your daughter, an unfamiliar voice asked. Unfortunately, my mother's voice chimed in, and they all laughed. I should have hung up, should have ended the call and preserved some illusion, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only listen. She owns that beautiful house you showed us pictures of, another voice asked. Technically, my father said. My mother left it to her instead of us, clearly going senile at the end. But don't worry, my mother added. We're working on fixing that mistake. Gregory has been documenting everything, every repair, every bill, every improvement. Our lawyer says if we can establish that we've been primary caretakers and she's been negligent, we can challenge the ownership. Clever, someone commented appreciatively. It's only fair, my father continued. We raised her, spent everything on her. That house should have been ours from the start. Lena's been nothing but a burden since the day she was born. At least now she's a burden with assets we can reclaim. The word hit me like a physical blow. Burden. There it was, spoken casually, matter-of-factly, as if it were simply an accepted truth rather than a wound that had shaped my entire existence. The plan is simple, my mother was saying. We establish residency, make her look like an absentee owner who only cares about taking our money. She's always at work anyway, barely maintains the place without our constant reminders. Another year or two, and we'll have enough documentation to make our case. And she has no idea, someone asked. Lena. My father laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. She's so desperate for our approval, she'd hand us the deed if we asked nicely enough. We just need to be strategic about it. Make her think it's her idea. Like that Europe trip, my mother added. She practically begged us to let her pay for it. More laughter, the sound of glasses clinking, a toast, perhaps, to their clever manipulation of the burden they'd raised. I hung up. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the phone twice before managing to set it on the counter. 28 years of suspicion confirmed in a single overheard conversation. 28 years of making myself smaller, giving more, expecting less, hoping that someday I'd finally pay off the debt of my existence. But it was never a debt, it was a con. I sank onto the kitchen floor, ignoring the water still dripping from the ceiling, and tried to process what I'd heard. They weren't just taking advantage of my generosity, they were actively plotting to steal my inheritance, every demand for money, every renovation they'd insisted on, every document they'd kept for tax purposes. It was all part of a calculated plan. The burden they'd called me wasn't just emotional manipulation anymore. I was literally a burden to be shifted, managed, and eventually discarded once my usefulness was exhausted. I sat there for hours, rain pattering against the windows, water pooling on the floor, memories flooding through me faster than I could process them. Every birthday where they'd sighed about the cost of a cake. Every Christmas where my gifts came with reminders of their sacrifice. Every achievement diminished by comments about what it had cost them to make it possible. "We gave up our dreams for you," they'd said. But what dreams? The dream of a childless life. The dream of disposable income. The dream of freedom from the basic responsibility of raising the life they'd chosen to create. I thought about Grandma Margaret, how she'd seen through them even then. How she tried to give me not just a house, but a chance at something they'd never allowed. The opportunity to exist without apology. And now they were planning to take even that away. As dawn broke, painting the damaged ceiling in pale light, I made my decision. They wanted to document everything. Fine. So would I. But I'd learned from the best con artists in the business, my own parents. And this time, the mark would become the player. I started with the insurance claim, handling it myself without their input. The adjuster was thorough, and I made sure to mention that I was dealing with the damage alone while my parents vacationed in Europe on my dime. Just casual conversation, but documented in his report. Next, I visited my lawyer, not Rachel Connors yet, but a colleague who specialized in property law. I presented my situation as a hypothetical, careful not to reveal the full scope of my parents' betrayal yet. If someone owns a property outright, I asked, and allows family members to stay there temporarily, what are the risks? He pulled no punches. Significant, especially if they're documenting expenses and improvements. In some states, they could claim equitable interest or even adverse possession if they can prove primary residency and investment in the property. You'd need clear documentation of your ownership and their status as guests. And if they're already living there, then you need to act fast, establish clear boundaries, document everything, and consider formal rental agreements or, he paused, or remove them from the property entirely. The word remove echoed in my mind as I left his office. Could I do it? Could I evict my own parents? Then I remembered burdens since the day she was born. Yes, I could. But I'd need to be smart about it. They'd taught me well, after all, how to be calculating, how to keep score, how to present a facade while planning something entirely different. The student was about to surpass the teachers. I spent the next week gathering evidence of my own. Bank statements showing every payment I'd made. Emails where they'd demanded money. Text messages treating me like an ATM with inconvenient feelings. I photographed every change they'd made to the house, every piece of Grandma's belongings they'd discarded or sold. In her study, which they'd converted into a storage room, I found boxes of papers they'd hidden, letters from Grandma to me that they'd intercepted, cards with checks they'd cashed without telling me. And most damning, a notebook in my father's handwriting outlining their exact plan, dating back to before they'd even moved in. Phase 1. Establish residency and dependence. Make L feel obligated to provide. Phase 2. Document all expenses and improvements. Keep receipts. Build case for investment. Phase 3. Gradual psychological pressure. Increase demands until she either signs over willingly or provides grounds for legal challenge. Phase 4. Consult with Barrett about specifics of property transfer, possibly force sale and claim proceeds based on established investment. They'd been planning this before Grandma's body was cold. The very people who'd brought me into this world had been scheming to strip me of the only thing that had ever been truly mine. I photographed every page, backed up everything to multiple cloud services, and then carefully replaced the notebook exactly where I'd found it. They had no idea I knew. That was my only advantage, and I intended to use it. Rachel Connors came recommended by a colleague who described her as ruthless when it comes to property disputes. She was exactly what I needed, sharp, experienced, and completely unmoved by family sob stories. "Let me see if I understand," she said after reviewing my documentation. "Your parents, who received a cash inheritance, moved into your inherited property under false pretenses, and are now plotting to steal it through legal manipulation. That's the summary. Yes. And you have proof of their intentions. I showed her the photographs of the notebook, the recorded conversation from the restaurant, the paper trail of their scheme. She smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. Ms. Harper, what they're attempting isn't just unethical, it's fraud. We could pursue criminal charges. I don't want that, I said quickly. I just want them out and my house secured. Then here's what we're going to do. Her plan was elegant in its simplicity. First, I would establish clear documentation that they were guests, not tenants or co-owners. Then, I would sell the house to a buyer of my choosing, at a price I determined, with a closing date that gave them minimal time to respond. But won't they fight the sale? I asked. They can try, Rachel said. But they have no legal standing. They're guests in your home. You have no obligation to inform them of your financial decisions regarding your own property. And their claim about investments in the house, without a written agreement, their investments are legally considered gifts. Besides, she pulled up the bank statements I'd provided. Every payment came from your accounts. They have no proof of financial contribution. We scheduled the sale for 3 weeks later, 1 week before my parents were due to return from Europe. I used my professional connections to find a cash buyer willing to close quickly and quietly. The price was slightly below market value, but still substantial enough to set me up for life if invested wisely. The hardest part was maintaining normalcy. My parents called sporadically, always with new expense requests. I approved them all, knowing it would be the last money they'd ever see from me. Let them enjoy their final vacation on my dime. Consider it severance pay for 28 years of emotional labor. I hired a moving company to pack everything that belonged to them, and only them. Every item they'd brought into the house, every piece of furniture they'd purchased with my money, every document they'd accumulated, I was scrupulously fair, photographing everything for legal documentation. Their belongings went into a storage unit, paid for 3 months in advance. The key and rental agreement would be in the envelope I'd leave for them. My own belongings were minimal. I'd learned to travel light, to not get attached to things. The only items I truly cared about were Grandma's personal effects, her jewelry, her books, her photographs. Those had been boxed and moved to my new apartment the day after I spoke with Rachel. 3 days before closing, I walked through the empty house one last time. It looked larger without furniture, echoey and strange. In the master bedroom where my parents had slept, I found the indent of their bed still visible in the carpet. In the kitchen they'd insisted on renovating. Water stains marked where the leak had been repaired. I thought I'd feel sadness. This was Grandma's house, after all, my sanctuary and refuge. But buildings are just buildings. The memories I carried with me. What I was leaving behind was the weight of being unwanted in my own home. The closing was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday. My parents' flight landed at 6 p.m. the same day. By the time they reached the house, I'd be gone. The new owners would have changed the locks, and their decades-long plan would crumble into dust. I left the envelope on the kitchen counter where they'd be sure to see it. Inside the storage unit information, a check for $10,000, call it a return of their inheritance, and a letter I'd written and rewritten a dozen times before settling on simplicity. Mom and Dad, surprised a burden managed to do this. I heard your conversation at the restaurant. I know about your plan. I've documented everything, and my lawyer has copies of it all. Your belongings are in storage unit 147B at Secure Store on Maple Avenue. First 3 months are paid. After that, it's your responsibility. The check enclosed represents a full and final settlement of any claims you might imagine you have. Cash it. And you accept that this concludes our financial relationship permanently. I've changed my phone number and email. Don't attempt to contact me at work. I've already informed security and HR about the situation. You taught me that love comes with a price tag. Consider this receipt marked paid in full. Lena, I debated saying more, pouring out 28 years of hurt, demanding explanations, seeking some acknowledgement of the damage they'd done. But what would be the point? They'd shown me who they were. Believing them was the least I could do. The new owners were a young family, excited about the space and history of the house. The wife was pregnant with their first child, and they spoke about nursery plans for the room that had once been mine during those weekend escapes. "It has such good energy," she said during the final walkthrough. "Like it was meant for children to be happy here." I smiled, thinking of Grandma Margaret. Yes, it was. At 5:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. International rates, I noted. Probably my parents, only now realizing their calls weren't going through. I deleted it, unread, and blocked the number. At 6:23 p.m., as I was unpacking books in my new apartment, my work phone rang. The security desk. "Ms. Harper. There's a couple here claiming to be your parents. They're quite agitated. Should we call the police? Are they threatening anyone?" "No, just demanding to see you. Saying something about theft and lawyers." "Tell them I'm unavailable. If they don't leave, then yes, call the police and security. They're not to be admitted to the building again." "Understood. Ms. Harper." I turned off the work phone too. Tomorrow I'd deal with whatever fallout came. Tonight, I was just Lena, sitting in her own space, paid for with her own money, beholden to no one's expectations but her own. The next morning brought the confrontation I'd known was inevitable. They were waiting outside my office building, looking haggard and older than I remembered. 6 weeks of luxury hadn't softened the sharp edges of their entitlement. "Lena." My mother's voice cracked across the sidewalk. "How could you?" I stopped walking but maintained distance. "How could I? What, sell my own property?" "Our home," my father spat. "You sold our home." "I sold my house," I corrected. "The one Grandma left to me, the one you were guests in." "We're your parents." "Yes," I agreed. Parents who called me a burden. Parents who spent years planning to steal my inheritance. Parents who documented their scheme to defraud me in a notebook I have copies of. The color drained from their faces. Good. Let them understand how it felt to have the ground shift beneath them. "We raised you," my mother said, defaulting to their favorite refrain. "You did the legal minimum," I replied. "And you resented every second of it. I know because you've told me, repeatedly, for 28 years. You owe us nothing." The word came out sharper than intended. "I owe you nothing. Check your account. I left you $10,000. That's more than you ever spent on me that wasn't legally required. We're square." 10,000. My father laughed bitterly. "That house was worth $1 million. And it was mine to do with as I pleased. Just like your 50,000 was yours. How much of that did you blow in Europe, by the way?" They exchanged glances. "All of it, then, of course." "We'll sue," my mother threatened. "Go ahead." I pulled out my phone, showing them Rachel's contact. "This is my lawyer. She's expecting your call. She has recordings of you admitting to fraud, documentation of your plan to steal my property, and evidence of years of financial exploitation. Please, sue me. I'd love to see it play out in court." The bravado leaked out of them like air from punctured tires. They looked smaller somehow, diminished without the power to make me feel worthless. "Where are we supposed to go?" my mother asked, and for the first time in my life, I heard actual fear in her voice. "That's not my problem," I said, echoing words they'd said to me countless times when I'd needed help. "You're adults. Figure it out." "Lena, please." My father's voice broke. "We're your family." "No," I said quietly. Family doesn't treat people like burdens. Family doesn't plot to steal from each other. Family doesn't spend decades making someone feel worthless and then expect loyalty in return. I started walking toward the building. "You're just like your grandmother," my mother called after me. "Cold, selfish." I stopped, turned back one last time. "Thank you. That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me." The security guard held the door open, nodding respectfully. I didn't look back to see if they were still standing there. I'd spent 28 years looking back, hoping things would change, that I'd finally be enough. But I'd been enough all along, just not for them, and that was their loss, not mine. The next few months were an adjustment. I'd prepared for the practical aspects, the legal threats that never materialized once their lawyer reviewed Rachel's evidence, the flying monkey's family friends and distant relatives who called to scold me for abandoning my parents, the social media posts painting me as an ungrateful daughter. What I hadn't prepared for was the silence. For 28 years, their criticism had been the background noise of my life, their demands, their disappointment, their constant reminder of my burdened status. It had shaped my days even when I wasn't conscious of it. Now, in its absence, I felt untethered. It's normal, my therapist assured me during one of our sessions. You're grieving, not the relationship you had, but the one you deserved and never got. She was right. I was mourning parents who'd never existed, the ones who should have celebrated my first steps instead of calculating their cost, the ones who should have been proud of my achievements instead of resentful of what they'd invested to make them possible. But grief, I learned, could coexist with relief, and I was relieved. God, was I relieved. My new apartment was smaller than Grandma's house, but entirely mine. I decorated it with colors my parents had called impractical and filled it with books they deemed waste of money. I cooked meals without commentary about grocery costs and slept without calculating what my existence had cost anyone that day. I discovered I actually liked who I was when I wasn't constantly defending my right to exist. Work flourished without the emotional drain of managing my parents' expectations. I took on bigger clients, closed larger deals, and finally accepted the promotion I'd been turning down for years because it would mean less availability for my parents' demands. You seem different, my colleague Marcus observed after a particularly successful negotiation. More present. I've been doing some house cleaning, I told him, getting rid of things that weren't serving me anymore. He laughed, thinking I meant actual possessions. If only he knew. 6 months after the sale, I received a letter forwarded from my old address. My parents, it seemed, had found stable housing, a small apartment in a less expensive city 2 states away. The letter was written in my mother's careful script, 4 pages of justification, manipulation, and demands disguised as apology. We understand you were hurt by our conversation, she wrote. Not, we're sorry for what we said, but placing the responsibility for hurt on my reaction rather than their words. Perhaps we were too harsh in our assessment, she continued, but you must understand the stress we were under. Must I thought, reading through their rewritten history where they were victims of circumstance rather than architects of cruelty. The final page contained their new scheme. If you could see your way to helping us with a small monthly amount, nothing like before, just enough to supplement our social security, we could work on rebuilding our relationship. There it was, the price tag on their affection, as always. Pay us, and we'll pretend to love you. The only difference now was they were offering a payment plan instead of demanding a lump sum. I fed the letter to my shredder, watching their words turn into confetti. Then I made myself a cup of tea, expensive tea, the kind they'd have called wasteful, and sat on my balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. My phone rang. Rachel Connors. Thought you should know, she said without preamble. Your parents consulted with 3 different lawyers about challenging the sale. All 3 turned them down once they reviewed the documentation. You're in the clear. Thanks for letting me know. There's more. The investigator I hired found something interesting. Your parents. They've been telling this story for years, not just to you. They've run this con on 3 different elderly relatives, moving in as caretakers and then claiming rights to property. Your grandmother was the first one to outsmart them. I shouldn't have been surprised, but somehow I was. So I wasn't special. Oh, you were special, Rachel corrected. You were their longest con. The others caught on within months. You endured it for 28 years. That takes a special kind of strength. After we hung up, I thought about that word, strength. My parents had certainly never used it to describe me. Burden, disappointment, expense, obligation. Those were my labels, but never strong. Yet here I was. I'd survived 28 years of emotional abuse disguised as parenting. I'd built a career despite their constant undermining. I'd found the courage to walk away from the only family I'd known. And I'd done it all while being told I was worthless. If that wasn't strength, I didn't know what was. A year passed, then 2. The flying monkeys gradually gave up when I refused to engage. The family events I wasn't invited to became blessings rather than exclusions. The space my parents had occupied in my life filled with better things, genuine friendships, hobbies I'd never had time for, the simple pleasure of existing without apology. I started volunteering with an organization that helped young adults escape abusive family situations. Turns out, my story wasn't unique. The details varied. But the core was the same. Children treated as burdens, investments, or possessions rather than people. Children who grew up believing their worth was measured in how much they could provide rather than who they were. The hardest part, one young woman told me during a session, is that they're not cartoon villains. They're just people who had kids they didn't really want and then made it the kid's problem. The hardest part, I corrected gently, is believing you deserve better. Once you believe that, the rest is just logistics. She looked skeptical, the same way I'd have looked if someone had told me that at her age. But she kept coming to sessions, kept working on her exit plan, kept inching toward freedom. 6 months later, she sent me a photo from her new apartment, keys in hand, smile radiant. "Thank you for showing me it was possible." Her message read. I printed the photo and pinned it to my bulletin board, next to a picture of Grandma Margaret in her garden. 2 women, generations apart, who'd understood that sometimes love means letting go. My parents tried one more time to contact me, through a cousin who'd maintained neutrality in our family divide. Would I consider mediation, they wondered, perhaps with a professional to help us communicate. The cousin, well-meaning but naive, painted it as growth on their part. They'd been attending therapy, apparently, working on themselves, ready to acknowledge their mistakes. "What kind of acknowledgement?" I asked. She faltered. "Well, they said they understood why you were upset about the house. Do they acknowledge calling me a burden, plotting to steal my inheritance? Decades of emotional abuse." Silence, then, quietly. "They said there were misunderstandings on both sides." I laughed, not bitterly, just with genuine amusement at the predictability of it all. "Tell them I wish them well in their journey of self-discovery. But that journey doesn't include me. They're getting older, Lena. Don't you think? I think they had 28 years to treat me like a daughter instead of a debt. They made their choices. I've made mine." The cousin didn't contact me again, but I heard through the grapevine that my parents had shifted their narrative. Now they were the victims of an ungrateful daughter who'd stolen their retirement home. The con continued, just with a different mark. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like with different parents. Parents who celebrated my first words instead of calculating speech therapy costs. Parents who kept my childhood drawings instead of complaining about wasted paper. Parents who saw college acceptance as an achievement instead of an expense. But that way lies madness. We don't get to choose our parents any more than they technically get to choose us. We just get to choose what we do with the cards we're dealt. I chose freedom. I chose self-worth. I chose to believe Grandma Margaret when she said I got to decide my own value. The house on Hawthorne Street still stands, home now to that young family. I drove by it once, curious, and saw toys in the yard and flowers in the window boxes. The roses are gone, but there's a vegetable garden where they used to be. And children's chalk art decorates the driveway. It looks happy. It looks loved. It looks like what a home should be. I don't regret selling it. Buildings are just buildings. After all, what made it special was the woman who'd shown me kindness within its walls. And I carry her with me everywhere. "Don't let anyone convince you you're a burden," she'd said. It took me 28 years, but I finally listened. These days, when I close particularly difficult deals or navigate tricky negotiations, Colleagues ask how I stay so calm under pressure, how I manage to walk away from bad situations without looking back, how I know when enough is enough. I tell them it's experience. What I don't say is that when you've spent your entire life being told you're worthless by the people who should love you most, professional rejection loses its sting. When you've walked away from your own parents, walking away from a bad deal is nothing. My superpower, forged in the fires of emotional neglect, is knowing my own worth. And that worth has nothing to do with what I can provide, produce, or pay for. It has to do with who I am, and who I am is not, and never was, a burden. Who I am is a woman who survived, a woman who thrived, a woman who learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and others is refuse to play a game where your value is always in question. My parents taught me many things, though not the lessons they intended. They taught me that blood doesn't guarantee love, that family can be the source of our deepest wounds, that some people will only value you for what they can extract from you. But in teaching me these dark truths, they also taught me their opposites. That chosen family is often stronger than blood. That healing is possible even from the deepest wounds. That your value exists independently of others' ability to see it. And perhaps most importantly, they taught me that when someone shows you who they are, believe them. They showed me, clearly and consistently for 28 years, that I was nothing more than a burden to them. A financial drain. An obligation they resented. A problem to be managed and eventually monetized. I believed them, and in believing them, I set us all free. They're free to live their lives without the burden they never wanted, and I'm free to live mine without the weight of trying to earn love that was never available. Some might say I was cruel, that I should have been the bigger person. That family deserves forgiveness, second chances, unconditional love. To them I say I gave 28 years of chances. I forgave countless cruelties in the hope that this time would be different. I loved unconditionally even as conditions were placed on every gesture of affection I received. Being the bigger person nearly made me disappear entirely. So no, I don't regret my choices. I don't lie awake wondering if I should have tried harder, given more, been better. I know with bone-deep certainty that nothing I could have done would have transformed me from burden to beloved in their eyes. The only transformation possible was the one I chose, from burden to human being, from obligation to individual, from their daughter to my own person. That transformation required distance. It required boundaries. It required the kind of decisive action they'd taught me through their own example, putting my financial and emotional well-being first, just as they'd always put theirs above mine. The irony isn't lost on me. In trying to con me out of my inheritance, they gave me the greatest gift possible, the strength to walk away. In calling me a burden, they freed me from the weight of their expectations. In plotting to take everything from me, they showed me exactly what I needed to leave behind. The house was never really what they wanted anyway. They wanted control. They wanted to win a game they'd been playing since my birth, the game of making me pay for existing. The house was just the final level, the boss battle in a war I never agreed to fight. By selling it, by walking away, by refusing to play anymore, I didn't just win, I changed the game entirely. Now I live in my smaller apartment with its impractical colors and wasteful books. I sleep well knowing no one is calculating the cost of my dreams. I wake up without the weight of unearned guilt. I exist without apology, love without condition, and give without keeping score. If that makes me cold and selfish like my grandmother, then I wear those labels with pride. She knew something my parents never learned, that true coldness is bringing life into the world and then resenting it for breathing. True selfishness is seeing your child as nothing more than a retirement plan with unfortunate feelings. What we did, Grandma Margaret and I, wasn't cold. It was self-preservation. It wasn't selfish. It was self-respect. And in the end, that's the greatest inheritance she could have given me. Not just a house, but the permission to value myself. Not just property, but the power to protect my worth from those who would diminish it. The $1 million house is gone. Sold to people who fill it with joy instead of schemes. But what I kept is priceless. The knowledge that I am not, never was, and never will be a burden. I am a person, a whole, complete, valuable person. And that's worth more than any house could ever be. As I finish writing this, the sun sets over the city, painting the sky in shades that remind me of evenings in Grandma's garden. Somewhere out there, my parents are likely spinning new tales of victimhood, finding new marks for their endless need. I hope they find what they're looking for, though I suspect they never will. When you see people only as sources of supply, you doom yourself to perpetual emptiness. When you view love as a transaction, you bankrupt your soul. But that's their journey now, not mine. My journey is different. It's smaller in some ways, no Victorian mansion, no European trips funded by guilt, no family gatherings where I foot the bill for my own emotional abuse. But it's also infinitely larger. Because when you stop trying to purchase love that was never for sale, you discover you can afford so much more. Peace, dignity, self-respect, the quiet joy of a life lived on your own terms. These things can't be stolen, schemed away, or demanded as payment for services rendered. They can only be claimed by those brave enough to say enough and mean it. I was brave enough. And that bravery, more than any house or inheritance, is my true legacy from the grandmother who saw me clearly and loved me anyway. To anyone reading this who sees themselves in my story, who knows the weight of being called a burden by those who should call you beloved, know this: you are not too much, you are not too expensive, you are not a debt to be repaid or a problem to be solved. You are a person deserving of love that doesn't come with a price tag. And if the people who brought you into this world can't see that, then perhaps it's time to stop paying for a love that was always counterfeit. Perhaps it's time to invest in yourself instead. The returns, I promise you, are extraordinary.